I've lived in the same small town my entire life, which, granted, hasn't been for very long. My family moved here right before I was born. When I asked each of my parents why they chose this place to settle down and start a family, they both told me it was the other's idea. My mom told me that my father wanted to get back to nature, so a small rural town was perfect. On the other hand, my father told me that it was my mom's idea, that she was exhausted from the fast-paced lifestyle of living in the city. Ultimately, they both just wanted a nice, quiet place to start a family. Our town is, for lack of a better term, tiny. There are only a handful of shops in the town center and hardly much else. Most of the time, if you want to see or purchase anything worthwhile, you'd have to take the main road to the next city over. It was a hassle, but that's what happens when you live so far removed from society. Our house is situated a bit further away from the town itself. We live in a small neighborhood in the middle of the woods, basically. There are other houses where we live, so it's not wholly isolated, but still, you'd be hard-pressed to get a pizza delivered out this way. By the time I was old enough to walk around outside on my own, I had met all of my neighbors. Well, almost all of them. Living in the house directly adjacent to ours was a woman in her mid-30s. She was incredibly nice, and would visit us often. Her and my mom became very close friends. I later found out that she has a son of her own who was much older than I am, but he went traveling abroad some time ago. A bit farther down the road, if you can even call a dirt trail a road, lives another family. They are an older couple. It's funny when I think about it, as it's probably a perfect example of my parents in about 30 years. They both spend their days sitting on their front porch, watching nature from the comfort of their own house. Throughout the year, my mom would send me over to their place from time to time with baked goods, and they'd always let me take a few pieces as payment for delivery. They were very kind, and gave off that loving grandparent kind of vibe, though I'm not sure they ever had any children. Not all of my neighbors were as approachable as the others. There was a man who lived in a house a bit further down from us. From what my parents have told me, he's a much older man who mainly likes to keep to himself. He rarely leaves his house, and the few times my parents have spoken to him, they told me that he was a little strange. I've seen him only a handful of times when I walk by his house. He would often just be standing on his porch staring off into the distance. They told me it was probably best to avoid him, just to be on the safe side. Growing up in a town such as this one is somewhat difficult for a kid. There was hardly anything to do aside from chores or staying in my room all day. By the time I was a teenager, I was spending the majority of my day helping my mother do yard work. She had gotten into gardening sometime during my youth. Over time, she had turned our whole front yard into a crop field, basically. She was growing almost everything. At first, it was just to supplement our food stores, so we didn't have to travel into town very often. But eventually, it grew even larger than that. We started giving away free produce to our neighbors who gladly accepted. Then she even started selling the surplus to the market in town. While they do get regular shipments in, it was nice to have another source of fresh produce. So not only was she making our shopping trips cheaper, she was also getting paid in the process. My father, on the other hand, worked in the next city over. He worked for some corporation. He never really talked much about his job other than the long hours he had. I remember he took me with him to the city a few times, and each of those times I was utterly overwhelmed. My life was progressing normally until one day, I ventured farther away from home than I should have. It was the middle of summer, and after finishing all my chores, I decided to go out for a walk. This wasn't something new, as I've often taken walks around the neighborhood. It was a sort of cathartic ritual I had, something that would put my mind at ease. I would walk along the tree line, bouncing a stick off every tree trunk I'd pass by, thinking about life, my plans for the future, school, and all the places I wanted to visit when I was older. My mind drifted, and before I knew it, the hot summer sun was no longer overhead. The last remnants of light were quickly fading behind the trees. I glanced around and realized that I was no longer in my neighborhood. I was now on a path through the dense forest. With this sudden realization came panic as I couldn't seem to get my bearings. Every single tree looked identical to me, and even the path behind me seemed unrecognizable. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes for a moment. I told myself that there was no need to panic, just to turn around and start walking back home. So that's precisely what I did. I began walking back the way I came. As I did, I began looking at the trees more closely. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like there was something in the trees. Something following me. Something stalking me. I started to pick up my pace a bit, walking faster and faster. It wasn't long until I was nearly sprinting through the woods. I could feel my lungs desperately trying to pull oxygen into my body to keep my legs moving. And then I tripped. My leg caught hold of a tree root and I fell face first into the dirt below. As I wiped the grime from my face, I heard something behind me. The snapping of a twig and the shuffling of leaves. Something was out there. I rolled over onto my back to see what it was, but it was far too dark to make out anything. I rose to my feet and looked around. There was nothing nearby as far as I could tell, but that wasn't my main concern at the moment, as I made the unnerving realization that I could no longer see the path in front of me. I started walking through the trees with my best guess, hoping I was going the correct way. After another 5 minutes of walking aimlessly, I heard that same exact noise again. I turned, and this time, I saw 2 eyes staring at me from the darkness. Seeing those eyes sent warning signals shooting throughout my entire body. Whether it was a person or something else, I couldn't be sure, so I ran. This time, however, I was trying my best to be more deliberate with my foot placements. After running for a few more minutes, I stopped. Those 2 eyes, which I had just seen behind me in the darkness, were now directly in front of me. Eyes staring at me with a malicious intent, like a predator cornering its prey. I felt my body freeze in place as I stared into those eyes carefully. Then, after a minute, the sound of a twig snapping in the distance sent this thing charging at me. It leapt through the air with incredible speed. It collided with me, sending me crashing to the ground. I struggled against it, but my strength was quickly waning. Seeing it up close now was terrifying. Its eyes were narrow and threatening. Sharp fangs snapped at my face over and over again. Its hands were like knives, and they were digging into my arms and shoulders. I felt helpless, like I was about to be devoured alive by whatever this thing was. I could feel my hands and arms begin to sting as numerous cuts began to appear on them. I was beginning to think I was truly going to die out there. With my options quickly running out, I took one last deep breath and summoned as much of my strength as I could muster. I shoved this thing as hard as I could. It flew off me, tumbling end over end into the dirt. I took this chance and scrambled to my feet. I started running, faster than I ever had in my life. I ran until my legs threatened to give out on me. In the distance, through the trees, I spotted a light. I could feel relief wash over me as my pace slowed. I made it just outside of the tree line and collapsed. As I was lying there with my vision fading, I could see someone running towards me. I came back to consciousness a little while later, a bright light overhead irritating my eyes. I instinctively covered them with my hands, and that's when I noticed that my hands and arms had been bandaged up. I looked around wondering what had happened and where I was. Then I heard a door open, and someone entered the room. I sat up and saw that it was that strange old guy my parents had mentioned before. He walked up to me and with a smile said, "Hello there. My name is Oak. People call me the Pokemon Professor."